You know, when we talk about national budgets, the story is usually about debt and making some really tough choices. But today, we're diving into a different kind of story, and it comes from Iraq. It's a genuinely surprising tale of a massive fiscal turnaround. So let's get into it and see how a projected crisis actually turned into a remarkable success.
To really get how big this story is, we have to start with this number. For both 2023 and 2024, the Iraqi government was bracing for a budget deficit of around 64 trillion dinars. I mean, that is a massive, massive hole to fill, and it posed a huge challenge to the country's financial stability.
So how'd they do it? In this explainer, we're going to unpack that mystery. We'll start by comparing the plan versus the reality. Then we'll look at both sides of the equation, the money coming in and the money going out. And that's going to show us how they turned that huge deficit into a surplus. Finally, we'll explore why this is such a big deal for Iraq.
All right, let's get to the heart of it. The gap between what was projected and what actually happened, well, that's where this story really gets interesting.
Okay, the scale of this turnaround is just staggering. The government was preparing for a deficit of 64.3 trillion dinars in 2023 and another 64 trillion in 2024. But in reality, the actual deficits were just a tiny fraction of that, only 6.8 trillion in 2023 and 9.8 trillion in 2024. So how on earth did they pull this off?
The first part of the answer is on the income side of things. To put it simply, Iraq brought in a lot more money than it was expecting to. Let's see where that cash came from.
Now, to understand Iraq's finances, you have to understand this one basic fact. The economy is absolutely powered by oil. We're talking about 90% of all government revenue coming from oil exports. That makes the country's financial health incredibly sensitive to what's happening with global oil prices and production.
And here is the first part of our answer. Oil revenues just blew past expectations. In 2023, they brought in an extra 8.6 trillion dinars. Then, in 2024, that number jumped to an additional 20.3 trillion dinars. This unexpected windfall, probably from higher global oil prices, gave the government a massive head start in closing that budget gap.
But bringing in more money was only half the story. To really transform the budget, you've also got to get a handle on your spending.
And here's the other crucial piece of the puzzle. Just look at the huge gap between planned spending, those taller bars, and the actual spending in the solid bars. In 2023, the government spent an incredible 56 trillion dinars less than planned. The next year, they underspent by over 61 trillion. Now, in a place where fiscal control has often been a real challenge, this is a powerful, significant display of discipline.
So how'd they do it? Well, the data shows they spent less pretty much across the board, on day-to-day costs and on bigger investment projects. But what's really critical is that they prioritize the essentials, things like public sector salaries and social welfare. That was a strategic choice to keep things stable for citizens. They even managed to spend nearly 3 trillion dinars less than they planned on servicing their debt in 2023. This wasn't just random cutting, it was smart financial management.
Okay, so you've got way higher revenues on one side and much, much lower spending on the other. When you put those two things together, you get a result that is, well, it's truly dramatic. This table just lays it all out. That planned deficit of over 64 trillion dinars, it was slashed by over 57 trillion in 2023 and by 54 trillion in 2024. What an incredible turnaround. But believe it or not, the story gets even better.
After years of just trying to manage huge deficits, this new trend of fiscal discipline led to something I don't think anyone really expected at the start of this journey.
An 8 trillion dinar surplus. That's right. In the first quarter of 2025, Iraq's state budget was actually in the black. It took in more money than it spent. This really marks a major turning point, moving from just managing a crisis to actually building a foundation of financial strength.
So these are some seriously impressive numbers. But what does this turnaround actually mean for the country? Why does this matter?
Well, there are 4 key takeaways here. First, it means greater financial stability. Less need to borrow means less pressure on the state's finances. Second, they're better prepared for a crisis. A surplus acts like a financial cushion to handle any future shocks. Third, by focusing spending on salaries and social care, they're protecting the day-to-day stability of their citizens. And finally, this kind of performance boosts their credibility on the world stage, showing international partners that they can manage their finances effectively.
So Iraq has demonstrated some really impressive fiscal control, turning a potential crisis into an actual surplus. The big question now, the trillion dinar question you could say,
is whether this moment of stability can be used as a springboard. Can they use it to finally tackle the country's biggest long-term challenge, diversifying the economy away from its dependency on oil? That is the next chapter in this fascinating economic story.